10, 9, 8.
And action.
All right, so good morning, everyone. Good morning, good morning. We have two new members of our advisory board who are joining us for our first meeting today, and I'll introduce them, and then we can go around and everybody can say who they are. Jennifer March, who is the Executive Director of Citizens Committee for Children. CCC is probably, many of you know that CCC is probably the premier child advocacy organization in New York. They've been around for a long time. Jennifer's been the executive director there for
A decade
a decade.
this year. Yeah,
All right.
this fall.
They have a keen interest in city and state budgetary matters. They opine on such matters regularly, and so I think she's going to be a great addition to our group. She is filling the slot on our board for an officer of a public interest advocacy organization involved in budgetary issues. Believe it or not, the document that created the IBO is very prescriptive about slots, so that's the slot you're filling. And just as an FYI, Jennifer spent 7 years working in the finance division of the city council as a budget analyst, and then as assistant director for intergovernmental, and so brings a wealth of relevant expertise to our group. Welcome.
Thank you.
Mark Canizero.
Morning.
Morning. Is also joining us for the first meeting today. Mark has just recently been appointed the president of the Council of School Supervisors, CSA, Supervisors and Administrators. He is replacing our former board member, Ernie Logan, who retired. So he is filling the slot for an officer of a labor organization, also mandated. Before his work at CSA, Mark was a public schools teacher and principal on Staten Island for many years, and so we welcome you.
Thank you very much.
So maybe we can all go around the room and say who we are. I'm Nancy Waxstein. I am privileged to chair this board. I am now at Fordham University.
I'm Ronnie Lowenstein, Director of IBO.
Again, Mark Canizero.
Deborah Golby, I'm the Chair of the Economics Department at Hunter College.
Greg Walker, I run my own investment firm.
Don Boyd, I'm the head of the Fiscal Studies program at the Rockefeller Institute of Government, part of SUNY.
And now you're filling which slot?
The nationally recognized budget expert, I think. That's a nice thing to say. I'm not recognized anywhere I go.
It's a hot thing these days. Mark Shaw, I fill the slot of a former city budget director.
Morning, I'm Phil McCoss. I'm Dean of the Zicklin School of Business at Brook.
And you're filling the slot of
A dean. That's the short description. Just gotta have a dean.
And Jennifer March.
Lisa Neary, I'm the general counsel at IBO.
Greg Shapiro, I'm budget analyst at the Queensborough President's Office.
Yeah, I'm the property tax analyst for IBO.
Arash Farahani, tax and public policy economist.
Christine Baker-Smith, education policy analyst.
West London Black Controller's Office.
Cole Rako, I'm the business tax analyst at IBO.
George Sweeting, Deputy Director, IBO.
Robert Callahan, labor and pensions analyst, IBO.
Dan Huber, environmental analyst at IBO.
Paul Lopatto, I'm the supervisor for social and community services here at IBO.
Just for Mark, and then the borough president and controller and public advocate as well have standing representatives or sitting representatives, I think, to this board, and so we usually have representatives from those offices here. Okay, Ronnie.
Okay. I'm going to keep it brief because the presentations are too good to cram. The main thing I want to do is talk about 5 recent hires, all of whom you just very briefly met, and follow up on a few things from last meeting and a couple of new publications coming out. First, there are 5 recent hires. You just met Christine Baker-Smith, right, who's an education policy analyst. She's recently completed a PhD in the sociology of education at NYU Steinhardt School, and her current focus is on guidance counselors, but more broadly on other school support services. Robert Callahan is over there, who is a labor and pension analyst, working basically on budget accounting issues. He has a master's in public policy from the Harris School of Public Policy, University of Chicago, and most recently worked at PFM, which is Public Financial Management, which is a large firm that does public finance consulting for state and local governments. We also met Arash, who's right over there, Arash Farahani. He's a recent PhD in economics from the University of Illinois, Urbana-Champaign, and he's heading up IBO's new responsibilities for evaluating tax expenditures. And I'll say more about that in a moment. And the last 2 hires are 2 economists who are replacing 2 economists who recently left. Yao, who we met, came to IBO from the Department of Finance, where he was working on property tax issues, and he's been pressed into service to do that here as well. And Cole, who's right over here, has a PhD in public policy administration from the University of Kentucky's Martin School. And he'll be forecasting business taxes for us, and also has the probably unhappy job of staying on top of business tax reform in Washington. Let me just follow up on 2 items from last meeting. For those of you who are here, I'm sure remember our discussion of the cost of providing free lunches. First of all, thank you for your comments. We made revisions that we needed to make. But even more important, you probably noticed that the other day the mayor announced that with the start of school there were going to be free lunches, not just for elementary school students, but for all students in the city's public school system from here on in. He's using the same program we described in detail. Interestingly, they haven't released a price tag for the program. There was some confusion on that, and actually the Times editorial said it would be costless.
Well, it's a free lunch.
Oh, I was trying hard. But in discussions with OMB, it sounds like their estimates are roughly in line with ours for the larger group of people who'd be covered. And going back to our new responsibilities for evaluating tax expenditures, we've got our first topic. We choose the topic in conjunction with the council, and we've chosen a topic that we can produce solid output on a fairly condensed schedule, because we're planning on getting the first report out before the end of this year. So the topic that's been chosen is the Commercial Revitalization Program that was instituted in 1995. The idea behind it was to to keep commercial buildings in Lower Manhattan occupied and from being emptied out. It was expanded in 2000, not just to Lower Manhattan, but Manhattan north of 96th and the rest of the city, the other boroughs. The program, the first part of the program, the commercial revitalization part of the program, is a combination of commercial rent tax and property tax incentives. For the broader expansion, there are no commercial rent taxes in those other places, so it's just the property tax component. And then it was expanded a 3rd time in 2005, part of Speaker Silver's Marshall Plan for Lower Manhattan, to spur retail leasing downtown. So we're taking a close look at it, and we'll see how well it did.
Bonnie, when you say that you now have more responsibility in terms of tax, can you explain what that is and where that came from?
Okay, well, it started with the council, which had a tax expenditure study commission, and I suspect you all know that tax expenditures are foregone taxes that happen because we're giving economic development incentives to firms typically, but also to other groups. The council felt that there wasn't adequate supervision after the fact on whether these made sense from a fiscal perspective, and they wanted an outside group that could do an impartial look in the rearview mirror and say, well, what did that get us? And we were ex officio on the commission. They decided that this was the best place to lodge the responsibilities. We did a lot of negotiating with them, and ultimately came up with the structure that we've got. So we added one position to primarily man this, and we'll bring in other resources as we need it.
Okay, and that's just starting up then?
Yeah, it's the first time we're actually doing this.
Okay. Any questions about that? Anyone?
So I just have one question. Is it formalized, or is it just something the current speaker did? It needs to be renegotiated.
The council adopted it. It was certainly something that the current speaker and the current finance chair wanted, yes. But it was adopted, and so we see this as going forward. I should say it also, the council did not kick in any additional money, so it's not going to be a major, probably will not be a source of debate going forward either.
But does it sunset at any point? I think that's maybe part of Mark's question. No.
But we have all sorts of guarantees written into it. If resources don't permit, we won't do it 1 year, things like that. If we don't have adequate access to data, we won't do it in that year. And I should say that one of our incentives for all of this was we're going to use it to push for greater access, particularly to business tax data, than we've had in the past.
Okay. Why don't we just take a moment so you can introduce yourself?
Sure. Matthew Washington, Deputy Manhattan Borough President. Glad to be here.
I'm really glad to have you. And Doug, did you want to?
Hi, I'm Doug Turetsky. I'm the Chief of Staff and Communications Director for IBO. And
Brian Lafferty, also for the Manhattan Borough President's Office.
Okay, great. Welcome.
Okay, so just reeling off a few upcoming publications. We've got several major studies coming out. One on educational achievement gaps in cities' public schools. We look at the gaps by race and gender, so it's black students versus white students, Hispanic students versus Asian students, female Hispanic students versus male Hispanic students. So all the possible combinations there, based on standardized tests in English language, arts, and math. The tests start in 3rd grade in New York City. So what we did was look at a cohort of students who were 3rd graders back in 2008 and 2009, and who remained consistently within the New York City public school system and advanced from grade to grade on schedule, so that 5 years later they're in 8th grade, and then tracked those kids' scores over time. So not only do we have the distribution of the achievement gaps in 3rd grade, we also look at how those gaps broaden or narrow across the various groups over time.
That's great.
Yeah, it's really interesting. We've also taken a close look at the economic incentives that were given in the Stuyvesant Town Peter Cooper Village deal, where the administration provided, I think it was $220 million in tax incentives to guarantee the continued affordability of 5,000 of the units on the sites. And the questions we're asking are the obvious ones. Did we really guarantee the continued affordability, whatever affordability means, and we talk about that at length, of the 5,000 units? And absent the deal, would the units still have been affordable? So that's coming down the pike. Some of you Good. Some of you probably remember yesterday's train mess-ups. Well, following an even larger train problems in July, it was, more specifically, it was a derailment on the Q line at the DeKalb station.
Yeah.
They pretty much threw, I mean, most of the system into crisis. We got a request from the Brooklyn Borough President to take a look at the economic impact of subway delays. Which is not, as it turns out, an easy thing to do despite how much data is out there. And so we'll be sending that along to Brooklyn shortly.
Ronnie, is that only as pertains to people who live and work in Brooklyn?
No, it was people who live and work in New York City. Although I think are we extending to people who are in the region?
For one part of it.
For one part of it.
What's the status of that one? It's done, pretty much.
It's in review, so we're sending it to a few people to read. And then finally, I guess the next thing that is actually physically coming out will be released on Tuesday by the Managerial Employees Association, which is the group that represents people like me. And if you recall, we got paid parental leave in exchange for giving up some vacation days for people who are long-serving public servants, and in lieu of a 0.47% raise that was supposed to happen, and for us and didn't.
0.47?
0.47, yeah. And so we were asked by the MEA to say, well, how much did it cost the city, and how much did our employees give up? And that's complete, and it's my understanding that they're going to be releasing on Tuesday.
Ronnie, what I'm thinking about during your report is maybe for our new members, you can say how some of the how requests come in and who they come from, and how these all get generated, because you mentioned the Brooklyn Borough President and the MEA. Can you just describe the process for how you undertake a study?
Okay. Basically, we get asked. We get asked questions by the general public. The press asks a lot of questions. Technically, we're supposed to respond to questions from the city's elected officials, except for the mayor. In a sense, we were created to be a small version of OMB to serve everybody else. And about a third of our time probably is spent answering questions that get lobbed at us. And another third of our time is probably spent doing studies that are generated by IBO's own analysts, who hopefully are in touch with people in the field and in touch with their council counterparts, and have some good idea of what's coming down the pike and what we can do. And I'd say the other third of our time is on mandated reports. Reports mandated by the city charter that look a lot like fiscal monitoring of the sort that other agencies might do.
So any elected official can request, and actually any citizen?
Anybody. You don't even have to be a citizen. Even a board member. Even a board member, yes, that has happened.
It doesn't guarantee we'll do it.
Yes.
Especially a board member.
Or even with an elected official. I mean, we tried not to put our resources where there have been recent studies that we think were well done, or studies that are so narrow in scope that they wouldn't be of interest to anyone else. Things like that.
Yeah.
Ronnie, can I just say one thing? Earlier this week I was speaking with Mark Funkhauser, who's the publisher of Governing and a former mayor of St. Louis, and he said he's an avid reader of your work, that there is no group that he knows of that's really quite like IBO anywhere in the country, and he was extraordinarily complimentary, so I just wanted to pass that on.
It's great. We get all of his publications.
You can put that on the blurb of your next book.
Thank you.
Can I ask a question about the study on educational achievement, or the gaps? Are you able in the data to identify whether or not there's been a disruption in school, like the student, not only look at test scores, but whether or not the student changed schools regularly?
Yeah, we know whether, and correct me if I'm wrong, Joe, we know whether the student has changed schools.
Or any other demographics about the student?
Like homelessness is what occurred to me also.
There are some, I can't recall what we do for the students who do have a disruption. I think the criteria was that they stay in the system. So
Right.
they're in the
Right.
system for 5 years.
And
They're in the cohort.
advance on schedule.
Right. But if they move between schools at an unanticipated break in grade, I think we would still include them in this study. There are other studies we've done where we use that as a marker or a definition for the cohort. We do track in this paper a number of different demographic characteristics, including ELL,
Poverty.
Income, yeah.
yeah, income. No, we don't know the
Poverty
income.
status.
We know the poverty. We know the. Actually, for this study, I think we use the schools. Let me. I don't want to say for certain, but I think we use the school poverty status.
The schools, yeah,
Yeah.
whether they're Title I, right.
You know, this suddenly raises a question. I know that being eligible for free lunch has always been used as a marker for poverty in studies of kids. Are they still going to keep track of that?
They have to.
Yeah, because it's the basis for receiving Title I funding.
Okay.
And some of the New York's concerns, at least they said, about extending free lunch to everybody was based on, well, what will happen to our Title I grants?
Right.
I should say that several other major cities have already done this. So Philadelphia was the first of them, and it hasn't in any way endangered their Title I funds.
so
it's no reason to stop marking that. It's just that we're not going to use that to give lunch. Right. Okay.
And we've, if you're interested, we did a paper a year or so ago, essentially proposing an alternative measure based on the census characteristics of the tracts that the kids live in,
Right.
and linking that to the schools. So it's a much more granular view.
Thank you. Ronnie, anything else?
No.
Your director's report?
Nope.
Okay, thank you. Now, as is our custom here, we have reports, presentations on current recent reports. And I'm glad that now we've moved the report on the solid waste management to second, so that we all have a chance to wake up a little bit before we get into solid waste. So, we're going to start with Paul on income support programs, which I think is of keen interest to a lot of us here.
And I should say,
thank you.
Paul is the head of our social and community services team.
Yes.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Well, good morning. Today I'd like to talk about President Trump's proposed budget for fiscal year 2018, which begins in...
Yeah, maybe we should go to solid waste.
But it's actually a lot of exciting stuff. Begins in October 1st, and it was expected that right about now we'd be having these massive debates in Washington about this Trump budget and counter proposals. But in the last few weeks, there was a deal that Trump cut with the Democrats that basically continued current spending levels until the end of December. So the debate's been put off until December, but it's still, the Trump budget is still very much in place. What do we know about the Trump budget? It was what they call a skinny budget. There's not a lot of detail to it, but we know that it includes extensive cuts to a whole wide variety of domestic programs. Some of these cuts are very unlikely to happen. For instance, he proposes to cut medical research, National Institutes of Health. You watch what's happening at the committee level now. The Republican-controlled committees, the appropriations committees, are voting out actual increases rather than decreases. So that's not going to happen. On the other hand, he has proposed extensive cuts to low-income entitlement programs, and the Republican leadership has expressed real interest here. So this is a real possibility. Recently, we did an analysis we put out in the form of a New York City numbers report. You can find that on our website. I'd like to go over that today, but go into a lot more detail than we were able to do in that short report. Okay, President Trump's proposed budget includes cuts to food stamps, which is now formerly known as Supplemental Nutrition Assistance Program, or SNAP. Also to a program called Supplemental Security Income, otherwise known as SSI, and cash assistance, which is otherwise known as public assistance or welfare. The formal word that everybody uses now is cash assistance, but it's the same thing. So how important are these programs to New Yorkers, and what exactly are they? In 2016, New York City residents received first $3 billion in food stamp benefits. So what is food stamp? The federal program goes back to the 1960s, and basically it supplies low-income eligible individuals with grants that they can only spend on food. They can go to grocery stores, bodegas. More recently, they tried to extend it to farmers markets so that people could have access to healthier foods. The program is run by the federal government, but the city implements it. So there's an administrative cost to the city, but none of the grants pass through the city budget. So that $3 billion is coming directly to individuals, New Yorkers, but it's not passing through the city budget. New Yorkers also receive $3 billion in SSI benefits. Now, the difference between this and food stamps is, although you would also have a low-income cutoff, in order to be eligible for SSI, you have to be either over age 65, disabled, or blind. This program also does not. These grants also flow directly to individuals. They don't flow through the city government. And then finally, New Yorkers receive about $1.5 billion in cash assistance. Cash assistance programs, there are actually 3 in New York, so 3 individual ones. They're all run by the city government, and all the money flows through the city budget in this case. The 3 are, first of all, family assistance, which applies to families with minor children, and that's funded entirely by federal funds, something called TANF, or the Temporary Assistance for Needy Families Block Grant. I'll talk about that more later. The other thing to know about that block grant is it's also used to fund a lot of social programs, so I'll get into more detail on that a little bit later. The second program is called Safety Net Assistance, which applies mostly to single individuals or couples without minor children. And the third program is called Safety Net Conversion, which applies to families who have been on family assistance but hit their federal 5-year limit. So the state, instead of dropping them, state and city picked them up on the Safety Net Conversion program. Unlike family assistance, which is 100% federal, the 2 safety net programs are funded entirely with city and state budget, mostly city. The formula now is 71% local, 29% state. Now there's overlap among all these programs. People who are on cash assistance are automatically eligible for food stamps. A lot of people on SSI are also eligible for food stamps, receive food stamps. And there, in some cases, there are people who are on both SSI and cash assistance. If your payments are low enough, you could still be eligible for cash assistance. And there are some mixed families where one individual is on SSI, but the rest of them are receiving cash assistance. So there's definitely overlap. Okay, how many New Yorkers received these benefits? In June 2017, about 1.7 million New York City residents received food stamps. About 421,000 received SSI. And about 364,000 received cash assistance. Now on this graph, I showed the caseload trends for all 3 programs over the last 12 years, since 2006. The easiest line to understand is the green one, supplemental security income. As you notice, it goes basically straight across over that time. So the caseload is held at a pretty much steady, a little bit over 400,000 individuals receiving. The reason for that is that eligibility here is based on federal disability, and you're either disabled or you're not, and therefore it's not really reflective of the economic state of the state of the economy. As things get worse, more people lose income, but if you're not eligible for disability, you can't be eligible for SSI. So it hasn't really responded to the recession. It's pretty much steady all the way across. Now, in contrast, if you see the red line, the food stamp line, has gone up extensively over time. There's been a lot of variability. And back in 2006, there were about 1.1 million New York City residents receiving it. At its peak in about 2013, it was up to about 1.8. Now it's down slightly to about 1.7. And there are 2 things happening here. One is that the city has made it easier to get on the food stamps over time. If you go back to the Giuliani administration, the Giuliani administration took a really tough line on both cash assistance and food stamps to try to get people not to apply. There were claims that they didn't inform people of their rights. They would make it difficult. They had to jump through all kinds of hoops, fill out all kinds of paperwork. You dealt with cranky caseworkers, things like that. So people were discouraged from doing it. The rolls were going down. At some point, the Department of Agriculture, which runs food stamps, actually sued the city for violating federal law. They say they were not fulfilling their duties to these people who were eligible. And then Bloomberg became mayor, and he decided to pretty much open the door, make it a lot easier to sign up for food stamps. And they did this by not only informing people of their rights, but they started to bring technology into it. So instead of having to fill out all kinds of paperwork and go back several times to visit your caseworker and wait in line, you could do it more and more over the phone, things like that. And more recently, they moved into an internet-based system, so that now you can do it basically all over the internet. You can even scan in a lot of your supporting documents and send those in. So it's much easier, and as a result of that, the take-up rate has increased over time. The number of people eligible who actually sign up has increased over time.
Well, do you have any sense of the magnitude of these, how much impact these administrative changes can have?
Well, I think the best evidence is the caseload itself, which was already rising even before the economic downturn. And
But Paul, how do you account for the slight decrease in the last couple of years?
well, I think the second thing that's happening is that food stamps is sensitive to the economy, as it's supposed to be. Because as you hit a recession, people lose their jobs, income goes down, more become eligible, more people apply. So nationwide, there was a big increase in food stamp caseload as you hit 2008, 2009, 2010. The economy really sank, unemployment rate really went up. What's happened since then, both here and nationwide, is that as the economy has improved, it looks like the number of people who are eligible is going down. So there has been some decrease.
You did the dollar amounts per capita, and this is the percentage of population. Are we more dependent than many cities, less dependent? I mean, or what's the impact to the city versus other cities?
Well, cities can generally have big food stamp population. And compared to the nation as a whole, I would think that the percentage of people here on food stamps is higher, because we have a very high poverty rate. Okay.
I guess part of the question is, if you controlled for the poverty rate, is New York City
Are we
more
doing
aggressive?
better? I don't compare state to state. I don't know what the comparison would be there. Right?
I'm just trying to get a sense.
It is
the data are interesting, but benchmarking against others is
the rate has increased here. The uptake rate. I don't know how that compares to other states.
Okay.
Can you plot the number of eligible recipients as opposed to the ones who
It's difficult to get an exact number. That they usually rely on census data, and then there's a lot of nuances on whether or not you're eligible. It depends on income and resources and things like that.
Yeah. I mean, I guess I'm surprised that the decline since I was about to say the so-called recovery has begun seems very small.
Makes that for math, right?
Well, I think there's some groups, and you can look geographically in the city that haven't, their median income hasn't recovered. They're
Right.
still
Right.
still
No,
doing
that's
worse
why I
than
called
they
it a
were.
so-called
Yeah, so I think that's why
recovery.
it's lower.
Also,
Yeah.
but during this time, there have been improvements in the process. So
Right.
they went to an internet-based system, so more people were eligible doing. That's offsetting some of the drop in eligibility.
Right.
Okay, the third line then is the cash assistance line, the blue line, and this line is surprisingly straight over this time because we've had a recession in the meantime. Didn't seem to respond to the recession. Now, the reason for this is that when the Bloomberg administration opened the door for food stamps, it really didn't do that for cash assistance. It continued to take a rather hard line. You still have to jump through a lot of hoops to get on cash assistance, and of course you still face prospect of having to be assigned to a work program, things like that. So a lot of people are still not bothering. And this is happening nationwide as well. There's been, as the recession hit, there was surprisingly little increase in the overall TANF rate, TANF acceptance rate. In fact, some Republicans who helped to write the bill back in 1996 actually expressed concern that it was not being responsive to economic need. Okay. Now, all three of these programs depend on federal funds. The blue portion is the federal and each. As you can see, most obviously food stamps is 100% dependent on federal funds. Supplemental security income right now is 88% federal and 12% state. When the federal government set up the SSI, the law, it allowed states to add a supplement. New York State opted in. It's been adding it every year, although it has become less generous over time. It hasn't given the cost of living increases, so that 12% is a bit lower than it used to be, but it's still 12% state, 88% federal, In the cash assistance category, I added all three programs together. So out of that 1.5 billion, about 600 million is from the federal funds, about 40%.
And has the state changed any of the eligibility requirements on that during this time period?
No. Okay, so what exactly is Trump proposing to do? First of all, he's proposing to cut food stamps. The Trump proposal reduces federal funding by 193 billion over 10 years. So that average is about, take an average per year, it's about 19 billion. Put that in context, the total food stamp budget nationwide is about 70 billion. How does it do that? The main cut would be from forcing the states to cost share. That is, states would pay a share of the grant cost, reaching 25% by 2023. Right now, the state pays nothing. The feds would pull back. The state would pay an increasing share over time. By 2023, it would be 25%. So if you apply this to New York State, where they're paying out about $5 billion a year, that would come to about $1.25 billion a year that the state would have to pick up.
Would the states be mandated to pick up that share,
Yes.
or
Well,
would they
well,
get to vote?
this is what they would be mandated to pick it up, but they would be given more freedom to cut benefits. So it's basically an invitation for them to cut benefits.
Okay.
Now, in New York State, if this happened, then we would face some uneasy choices. You could raise taxes to pay for this. You could cut other programs to pay for this. You could cut benefits, or you could cost share with the city.
Right.
For some, given the history here, it's quite possible that the localities would be forced to pick up a share. Additionally, in addition to that cost sharing, there would be cuts in benefits and eligibility requirements designed to bring down the caseload. So if you put all these things together, by the time it's fully implemented in 2023, the federal cuts would amount to more than a third of all federal funds for food stamps. Proposed cuts to SSI. There's not a lot of details here. What the budget proposed to do is reduce federal funding by $72 billion over 10 years, but they combine two federal disability programs. The two are SSI and SSDI. SSDI is regular Social Security that most of us pay into. If you become disabled, you are eligible for a disability pension. That's SSDI. SSI is a separate program where SSDI is paid for out of our payroll taxes. SSI is paid out of general revenues, and it's really available for low-income people, most of whom are either not eligible for Social Security at all, or else their payments are very, very low. The Trump budget doesn't really distinguish between these two. It's based on the idea that there are people getting disability who shouldn't be. So they're proposing that to make the eligibility requirements tougher to get some people working again and to save money that way. The grant reductions, which if you average them out over time between the two programs, they come to about 4% annually. So if you apply that to New York City, we're getting about $3 billion. That would amount to about $120 million in reduced grants to individuals. Finally, TANF, which in some ways is the most important in terms of this New York City budget. The Trump budget proposes to reduce federal funding by $22 billion over 10 years. So to back up a little bit, the TANF budget, the TANF came into being in 1996 when there was an extensive revision of the federal welfare law. The old system was a classic entitlement system where as caseloads rose, the feds would guarantee they paid a set amount, which in our case was 50%. So as the caseload rose, the total amount of federal dollars coming in would increase over time. What the Republicans who wrote this bill proposed to do was say, we'll give more power to the states, but we'll also turn this into a block grant. We'll give you one lump sum, and it will not rise over time, even if your caseload does. So that's your problem. It's up to you to handle it. And the original block grant size was based on the caseloads as they existed in the early 1990s when they were pretty high. Now, as the 90s went on and welfare reform was instituted, particularly here in New York City, but all over the country, the caseloads began to drop very rapidly. A lot of things were peaked. It was tougher to get on. They made it your life more difficult to run there. In a lot of cases, you were assigned unpleasant work programs like WEP, work assistance program here, where you were just like sent out to rake leaves. They tried to make it as unpleasant as possible. And in addition to which, the economy was improving, the unemployment rate was dropping, so a lot of people moved into the workforce. So the caseloads went way down, and as a result of that, the states were temporarily left in good shape because they had this block grant that was set at earlier levels, and the caseloads were going down. So they were spending a lot less money out of that block grant on grants, and had more to spend on other things. So people began to talk about this TANF surplus. It's all this money that's out there, and the advocates got excited because there was all kinds of possibilities for expanding social services. Never really worked out that way. First of all, it ignored the fact that the welfare law also brought mandates on it. You had to increase the workforce rate among public assistance recipients over time. That cost a lot of money. In addition to which, people participating were guaranteed childcare, so you had to increase the childcare budget over time. These were also very expensive. Nevertheless, there was some extra money around, which states used in creative ways to plug budget gaps. In New York State, at one point, they used it to pay for the tuition assistance program, which was never really intended for in the first place. The only real restriction on TANF was it had to be spent in some way on low-income programs. Over time, though, that $16.5 billion nationwide block grant was frozen, and it's still 16.5 today. So 21 years later, it's frozen. Its inflation-adjusted value has gone down by about 50%. So over time, states have had to make tougher and tougher decisions, pulling back TANF funding for various things. There's been less and less of it. What the Trump budget proposes to do is to take that $16.5 billion and cut about 10% of it out. So that would go away right away. In terms of New York State's block grant has been set at about $2.4 billion ever since 1996. So that would be a loss proportionally of about $240 million. In addition, it would do away with something called the contingency fund, which is an add-on that Congress votes to appropriate every now and then. The contingency fund is a little bit extra money that goes to states with relatively high unemployment rates. And New York has pretty much been getting this every year. In recent years, it's been getting up to $200 million. So that $2.4 billion that states been getting has actually been more like $2.6, $2.7 billion. So we would lose the direct base grant funds, about 10% of that, plus the contingency funds over time. Now, what are the implications of this?
Just one, the
Sure.
240 million, the state number, how much of that's in the city?
Well, I'm about to get to that, but basically it comes down to most of it's going to the city. Now, I'll show you here. I've gone back now, as I mentioned, TANF block grants used first to fund family assistance grants, but most of it is going to pay for other social service programs. So I went back and I looked at the program budgets of all the social service agencies, and I tried to find all the programs that had relatively significant amounts of TANF funding nowadays. So this is the list I put together.
So 1.8 of the 2.4?
That's right. 2.7 really, if you fit into the contingency. So we get about 2/3 of that. So not surprisingly, the biggest item is family assistance grants, which still gets about $637 million. The second biggest portion goes to pay for the homeless family shelters. Most most families in the shelters are eligible for family assistance. The city takes that money and helps pay for the shelter. And that $483 million amounts to more than half of the total budget for the family shelters. The next piece is child care subsidies. Back in '96, when the state passed implementing legislation a year later, actually, it set up something called the Child Care Block Grant. The Child Care Block Grant took federal funding for child care. It also put in state funds for child care, and it said whatever is available from that TANF surplus, we'll also throw in there. And so we'll create this one big fund, CCBG they called it, and then we'll split it up among localities. So New York City gets its own allocation, and then it uses that on its own child care subsidies. We're currently getting about $500 million of that a year. And right now, TANF is paying for about half of that. So in effect, we're getting $250 million in TANF for child care. To put that in context, that's a bit more than a quarter now of the child care budget at the Administration for Children's Services. They're funding about 100,000 children a year, and so that comes to about 25,000 children being paid for in effect by TANF.
So none of that goes to the Department of Ed for UPK or anything like that? It's all
No,
ACS?
TANF doesn't really pay for that. That's a different function. There are other funds. Give you a few other examples. Domestic violence, $61 million. That's about half the domestic violence budget. On any given night, there are about 2,300 individuals in domestic violence beds, so about half of that is paid for by TANF. Summer Youth Employment Program, which is always debated in the City Council every year. It's been expanding recently. It uses a whole bunch of different funding streams, including $16 million in TANF. That's about, out of a budget of about $100 million, and if you have about 60,000 kids were funded last summer, maybe approximately 8,400 of them were funded with TANF in effect. And then a lot of money is spent on administration. That's a large item, about 144 million. When I add them all together, I got 1.85 billion coming to the city out of that 2.7 billion or so. So you can see how dependent the city is on TANF funding. So if TANF was cut, you would there would be some serious choices to make. You could change the formula for family assistance and put in some state and federal funds, or you could start cutting programs. Unpleasant choices altogether. So in general, then, if you look at all three programs, there's a lot on the line here for both New York City residents as well as the New York City budget.
Okay. Great. Don?
Well, I think this is great. I didn't scour your webpage closely enough. I mean, I obviously read the short piece. Is all of this in a?
No.
Would you be able to provide the presentation?
Sure.
I would love to have it.
I will send it around there.
Very sobering.
Are all the are all the recipients of these programs legal residents?
They're all legal residents, yes, but not all necessarily citizens.
Okay, but so we can't assume that if all the illegal, I was about to say illegal citizens, but all the illegal residents leave the country suddenly,
That wouldn't
this
save.
will
That
solve
wouldn't
our
save any
problem.
money. That wouldn't
Okay.
save
Any other questions, comments? Don?
Regarding giving, was it a state share for the food stamps? Would that be?
No state share for SSI. There's no state share for food stamps.
I'm sorry, in the proposal.
Yeah. It's proposed.
That would be a state share, and then it would be kind of
The state would
a
decide.
state policy decision about whether.
For how you handle it.
Yeah.
And they're sort of inviting people to cut because they're saying, we're going to give you more power over.
There haven't probably been any discussions with the state yet about their thinking about.
Between the state and the city?
Exactly.
Yeah.
Yeah, but we know what they think, don't we?
Yeah, Jen.
Well, I think too, I mean, we have to pay attention. Some of these areas, you know, there's a right to shelter here. So irrespective of what happens at the federal level,
We've
we
got to
would
pay
be
for
stuck
it.
with a very big bill. Childcare subsidies, there's been a lot of pressure to try to reconfigure the income eligibility lower, which I think is wrong.
Right.
But some of the other areas, there's flexibility on eligibility, but homelessness is challenging.
Even on childcare, the public assistance children are guaranteed.
Right.
So we could come out of the low income childcare.
Yeah, it would come out of working poor.
But I think that you're making the same point Don was sort of hinting at, which is, you know, if and when these cuts happen, it'll cause a rejigger of the state city fisc, because these programs grew up as part of that negotiation at the time. If the feds back out paying for a piece of it, it'll just it'll fall into the entire state city budget. Mess. What comes out at the bottom may have nothing to do with caring about any of these specific issues.
Some of these functions are more core than others, right?
Yeah.
But that doesn't mean necessarily that they don't represent a large share. Like the HIV and AIDS services is a pretty significant share of the funding of that program, which is 140 million or something like that altogether. So, you know, they're pretty significant pieces, and if you eliminated any of them entirely in order to meet a target, you have obviously a significant hole in the budget of those programs. So it's not, none of this is going to be pretty if it actually comes about.
If the feds ever get around to making cuts this, I think there'll be a big debate in the state and the city, and you know how well they get along.
So we can look forward then to this federal budget proposal being debated in December?
Yeah, it's been a long time
Unless they
since.
bunt again.
Right.
Yeah.
We've only got till September 30th for tax reform.
So it's going to happen fast.
There'll be a new formula next week sometime.
It's been a long time since there have been 12 federal appropriations bills. I mean, so it could be a long time before any of this actually gets debated.
Good.
Good. That's the best news so far.
All right, any other questions? Paul, this is really, really good.
I'm ready for solid waste.
What I failed to do at the beginning was to ask for the approval of the minutes.
Oh,
Yes.
okay.
So our last meeting was on April 12th, and the minutes, I believe, are here. So I'm wondering if I can have a motion to approve the minutes.
I'll make that motion.
Okay, thank you. And all those in favor? Okay, have we done our duty?
Very good.
All right.
Oh, good.
Moving on.
Okay. So I believe now we have the report you've been waiting for, the assessing progress on the city's solid waste management management plan. Okay.
And this is Dan Huber, who's a member of our housing, environment, and infrastructure team.
Okay. Has this report been released, Ronnie?
It just came out
Just
a couple of weeks ago.
Very exciting.
what is it?
Very exciting.
I must have missed it.
I'm shocked.
Okay.
All right, very good. So the IBO has recently released a new report on the city's solid waste management plan. This is also known as the SWAMP, so keep that in mind as I talk. This overhauls the city's waste management system and how we deal with garbage. Our analysis assesses progress on this report at the halfway point of the 20-year plan, so started in 2006. We're about halfway through it. So first, a little bit of background. How did we get to the point where we needed to overhaul our waste management system? We've been sending our garbage to Staten Island at Fresh Kills Landfill for a long time, and then Mayor Giuliani decided to honor a campaign promise. He promised to close Fresh Kills Landfill, which he did, but there wasn't really a plan at the time with how the city would deal with the waste instead. So what they immediately did is they turned to an existing system of waste export, which was being used by the commercial carters to take care of commercial waste. There was existing facilities around the city. What happened with that is this was immediately criticized as inequitable, it was environmentally unsustainable, because most of these facilities are located in just two neighborhoods, which is the South Bronx and Greenpoint. This was causing congestion, noise, air quality impacts. The other piece is that by putting all of the city's waste into this, commercial systems, what had been previously, local landfill space started to fill up, and there started to be some pushback about taking New York City's garbage. So that had led to a rise in costs. The city was on a series of shorter-term contracts, and those had spiked. So this was an untenable situation. It was untenable, fiscally. It was failing to contain costs. It was inequitable. It was not fair across the city, and it was failing to minimize environmental impacts. So into this situation appears the solid waste management plan, which purported to exactly address those issues. However, this was immediately controversial, mostly because these issues are actually all in conflict with each other. The cheapest option may not be fair, and it might be environmentally unsustainable, and vice versa. So it's really a compromise document where you might have to have trade-offs, and obviously, people had concerns about that.
Dan, would you mind just quickly saying, what is the plan? By that I mean, is it a law? Is it a negotiated report? What is it?
Yes.
And I think that's who issued the plan.
Yeah, so the city issued the plan.
It was a Department of Sanitation?
Department of Sanitation, yeah. And it's actually mandated by the state. So this is something that the city has to do. They have to come up with a plan of how they're going to deal with solid waste. And does that answer your question?
Yes.
So it was issued,
but the city council approved it also.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes. Right. Exactly. And it's not something that, it's not like a law that the Department of Sanitation has to follow exactly, but it's a guideline that they have to follow to attempt to fulfill these and achieve goals and milestones that are in there. And just to give you sort of a mental concept of our waste management system, you're all familiar with the three bins. You have refuse, you have metal, glass, and plastics, and you have paper. So what happens, the refuse bin, you put that on the curb, the Department of Sanitation picks it up, they bring it to a transfer station, They dump it off, and it's usually a private company there. And then the waste gets taken out of the city either by rail or by barge or by truck. And that goes to landfills or waste-to-energy facilities all over the place. For the recyclables, those go to, the Department of Sanitation takes those to processors in the city or in New Jersey. They process it, get rid of the stuff that's not recyclable, and then they sell the resulting material on the scrap market.
Excuse me, when
Yes.
you said that the garbage goes all over the place, you
Yeah.
mean outside of the city? That
Yeah.
You are exporting some of your garbage?
Yeah.
All of it.
All of your garbage?
All of
It's
it.
all of it.
None of it ends up, some of it goes to Long Island, goes to New Jersey,
Yes,
goes to
yes, yes.
Western New York, goes
Okay.
to Virginia,
Okay.
all over the place. So, what happened? Well, the short answer is that we have less waste. This is the tons per day, and these bars are the tonnage per day that the city's producing. The bottom is refuse, and the top is what's in the recycling stream. And the first thing you'll notice is that the plan was enacted sort of at the high point of the amount of garbage the city was producing. The Department of Sanitation expected that the population would continue to increase and that we would be producing more garbage over time. The population did increase, but we did not have an increase in the amount of garbage. And this is really similar to, this is not unique to New York City. This has happened in other cities. It's, consumption habits are changing. So, it's not like this is something that's happened over here. And
Why are people producing less garbage?
I will get to that in a moment.
Be happy.
Excellent question. But, and it's a good thing. I mean, it's a very good thing. However, I want to draw your attention to this gap right here. And so this is what the city expected it would have to deal with, and this is what the city's actually dealing with. And this is probably only going to grow over time. And this has effects in terms of what it costs, in terms of our recycling rate, and what the future of the system is going to look like. And this just really cascades through everything the Department of Sanitation is trying to do. And so, why is it declining? The short answer is newspaper. There's about 61% less of it between 2005 and 2013. The other one is junk mail. This mixed low-grade paper. The only thing we really have a lot more of is the plain OCC and craft paper, and that's cardboard boxes, so Amazon boxes. So I mean, this is the vast majority of what the decline has been, and it's.
Shop online more.
Yeah.
Read newspapers online.
Yeah.
Or
Yeah.
not at all.
Yeah, exactly. So you might notice that when I talk about what's in the waste stream, you're going to see these 2 years, 2005 and 2013, quite a bit. There's no particular reason to have those, except that those are the years where the city did a waste characterization study. So you can always know what the tonnage is. I mean, they measure the tons of garbage we have every year, but you don't always know what's in there. In order to do that, you have to do one of these studies, and they're done exactly the way you think. You take the garbage off the street corner, and you open it up, and you go through piece by piece and decide what it is. So they don't do these every year. But
With gloves.
And this is just the paper.
yes, yeah. So you look at this, and you might expect that this would have significant impacts on how our recycling is doing, because disproportionately, it's recyclable waste that's going down. We have 17% less recyclable material in 2013 than we had in 2005, and only 6% less refuse. And that's even after we reclassified a bunch of plastics as recyclable. And so without that, if we hadn't done anything at all, there'd be 27% less recyclable material and the same amount of refuse. So this decline is recyclable, and you would think this has to have a large effect. So what we have here is a statistic which measures that. And the first thing is, this bottom line is what our diversion rate is. You'll notice that looks very flat. And what the diversion rate is just the percentage of our total waste that ends up in one of those recycling bins. So, in 2002, 20% of our waste was in the recycling bin, and the other 80% was going to landfills via the garbage. A note on the diversion rate is that you can actually have 100% diversion if you just take all your garbage and put it in the recycling. But, I mean, don't do that. But that's sort of how the system works. The other thing I'll just kind of note is you might notice that in 2002 we were doing pretty well, and then in 2003 the rate fell off a cliff.
Someone cut recycling.
Yes, somebody did. The city was in kind of a fiscal crisis. They're having a lot of issues.
Oh, I should for that.
Yeah. And the decision was made to suspend part of the recycling program, the metals, glass, and plastic. It was soon restored, as you can see, but we have never quite returned to the glory days of recycling that had occurred in the late 90s and early 2000s.
But why refer to them as glory days when the problem is that there's less stuff that can be recycled? I mean, that's a good thing, and therefore you'd expect the rate of recycling to go down.
Yes. Well, I partially refer to that is because the city measures their progress on recycling according to diversion rate.
Well, but that's
So-
very nice.
Yes. Yeah.
We'll get to that.
Yeah. And there is a relationship with how well you're recycling and diversion rate. It's not exact because of these issues, but there is a relationship there. I suspect that we might have been doing a better job, when the diversion rate was up around 20. But again, it's hard to tell because the contamination is extreme. So as I mentioned, the city does measure their progress by diversion rate. This top line is the diversion rate that was targeted in the solid waste management plan. You can see that was we're really never close to that one. And then in 2010, in realization that we're not on this track, the City Council set a new series of goals starting around 15% and increasing to 25%. But as you can see, we also have not been there. We've just been sort of stuck at around 15%. So why are we stuck at the same place when there's less recycled material? I mean, that's there's something going on. And the answer is twofold. First, as I mentioned, we expanded acceptance into more recyclable material, specifically this R2 plastic. That's like plastic forks, single-use plastic containers. So we now recycle all types of plastic except for film plastics, which are like plastic bags and styrofoam. So that's helped. Now there's more available to be recycled. And the other thing you'll notice is the capture rate here has increased for plastic, glass, and paper. Now the capture rate is different because that only measures the amount of recycled material that actually gets recycled. So you don't get any credit on capture rate for throwing your garbage in the recycling bin. You actually have to put recycled material in there to improve the capture rate. And so overall, you've actually had somewhat of a bump up, from 45 to 47%. So you've had a marginally improved capture rate. You've expanded acceptance, and that's just about offset the decrease in available recyclable material.
What explains the metal? Was the only one that's going the wrong way?
Excellent question.
What was it, Mark? What was it?
Metal is.
Metal's going the wrong way.
Yeah. So metal, most of metal is aluminum cans. And especially after the recession and then the commodities boom that occurred, at one point, private metal scrappers were paying 6 cents per aluminum can, which is higher than even the 5-cent deposit. And so you've had an increase in scavenging, and when this occurs, people tend to go to the recycling bags, the metal, glass, and plastic, because you're pretty sure you can find
cans are.
Yeah. Nobody's going to dig through the garbage bags in hopes there's an accidental can in there. So, this disproportionately takes metal out of the recycling stream and leaves it in the refuse stream. So
Why does it leave it in the recycling stream?
Because people
It takes it out of the Department of Sanitation.
Take out the same, I understand that.
So people take it off the street corner.
Yeah.
And so you have two bags. You have a refuse bag that's full of garbage, and you have metal, glass, and plastic that's full of recyclables. You go for the recyclable one and take the cans out
Oh, you're
of
saying
there.
a person leaves
Yes.
the metal in the refuse, but
Yeah.
that piece of metal that was extracted disappears from the denominator and the numerator.
Yes, it's still recycled privately.
Somewhere.
Yeah,
Right.
somewhere.
But it's not in these numbers.
The city is not recycled.
Right.
Exactly.
Okay.
Yeah, and it's also the most valuable part, so it lowers the value of the city's recyclables, which makes the processor less happy and makes them charge more money. So
it's the invisible hand.
yes, it is the invisible hand.
It's
Yeah.
actually not.
Just don't get up to it enough.
It's a long-term problem because the nickel deposit law predated the recycling law. And if you wanted an efficient system, you'd get rid of the deposit.
Right.
Yeah, exactly. So, essentially what we have here is we have a headwind of less recycled material that's being offset. However, in terms of that goal from the Solid Waste Management Plan of environmental sustainability, we're doing a little better job capturing our recyclables and we're producing less waste overall. Haven't exactly achieved the diversion rate goals, but there's evidence of improvement there. So what about some of the other goals? Specifically, have we contained costs? Has costs gone down? And if you recall, one of the problems was these volatile short-term contracts that were on sort of the local landfill market. And the issues were there. The city was concerned that as landfills filled up, they'd be stuck in a crunch, have nowhere to put our waste, and costs would skyrocket. So the idea was to put in place long-term contracts that would guarantee landfill space, would provide cost certainty to the city, and the thought was if you had a long-term revenue stream, you might even be able to negotiate a lower price. This has not happened. The top line here is the average cost per ton of the city's long-term contracts, and the bottom line is the average cost per ton of the city's short-term contracts. So they've generally come in to be a little bit more expensive, even though the city now no longer has an issue of where to put its waste. The other thing I'll note, it's not on here, but the same thing happened with recycling. The city's now in a long-term recycling contract, and this has sort of been the same thing where it's come in, a little bit more expensive than the previous short-term contracts. But in contrast, the long-term contracts were meant to guarantee landfill space, whereas the recycling long-term contract is meant to guarantee that the city keeps recycling. And the idea was that if you lock the city into a 20-year recycling contract, then it's going to be a lot harder to suspend the recycling system in the event of another fiscal crisis. So that's been successful. There are no more suspensions.
Is the city running out any of its long-term contracts and moving to short-term, or is it?
No, there still are some short-term contracts, mostly due to facilities that aren't yet operational, but the steady trend is fewer short-term ones. They'll keep a couple of short-term contracts for emergency. They have some they only put 15 tons a year in. It's just it's a contingency type situation.
What's the definition of long?
It's the 20-year terms. I think some of them are different, but it's decade scale as opposed to 1 to 2, 3 year type stuff. And you also kind of notice that we've had sort of an uptick here in the last couple of years, and that's because of the new marine transfer stations for refuse export. And the long-term contract cost for those has been much more expensive than the long-term contracts that are just sending waste out by rail. There's 3 more of them to open, so kind of the idea is that that line's probably going to continue to rise as more of the waste goes through a more expensive option. So speaking of those marine transfer stations, and our third goal in the Solid Waste Management Plan, which is increasing equity across the city. So how are we doing there? So the idea of the marine transfer stations and the infrastructure of the Solid Waste Management Plan in general is that each borough should be responsible for their own waste, or at least kind of each part of the borough. Brooklyn's actually split into 3 parts, but the Bronx and Staten Island are the whole borough is just one zone. And so each one of these zones would have its own method to export waste. If there was an existing facility in there that could use rail, then they would just start exporting from there by rail. And if there was not a facility, then you'd build one of these marine transfer stations that would take the waste out of the city by barge and would be located away from these current concentrations of waste infrastructure. These marine transfer stations are expensive though. As you can see, $200 million, $260, $180 million. These are more than they're initially anticipated to cost. And this is kind of one of those trade-offs. If you want to move things by barge instead of truck, and you want to put it in a fair distribution around the city, it's going to cost more money. The other piece of these is that, despite kind of the laudable goals that, we're going to, be more fair by distributing around and all these things, is that these marine transfer stations have been delayed. The first one opened in 2015, but we're talking about like a 5 to 10 year delay on when these open. And part of the reason for that, not all but part, is there's been a lot of community opposition to them. Nobody really wants to have sanitation infrastructure in their neighborhood, so as we know many things, like there's an issue of where exactly we site them. As a couple examples, East 91st, it's in the Upper East Side, that's faced intense community opposition.
Litigation, isn't it?
Yes, yeah. I mean, it's
next to a park.
yeah. Yeah, and one of those things is they've recently added another $35 million for a new ramp because of concerns about children playing in the park and the hazard and of the trucks driving by all the time. So these sort of things tend to delay it and increase the cost. Hamilton Avenue actually ran into a slightly different difficulty. That facility is actually done, but the landfill operator that they had contracted with pulled out of the contract at the last second. And it was headed to a landfill in western New York, which and when the local people caught wind that New York City's waste was going to be coming in ever larger quantities, they were displeased with that, and it faced a lot of community opposition. It just so happened that this particular landfill was going to be soon up for state approval for reauthorization, so the operator decided just to scratch this whole thing, and and cut the opposition off. But there is now a new contract on that. It may already be operating, and if not, within a couple weeks. It's basically this September, this fall, that's going to be going. The other piece I kind of want to mention over here is Gansevoort. That's actually not a marine transfer station for refuse export. That's for recyclables. And the idea there is there's a recyclable export terminal at West 59th Street right now. So if you move the recyclables down to Gansevoort, you could open up West 59th for commercial refuse export at a marine transfer station. And that would help kind of reduce some of the commercial truck traffic and get it at all these schools. Yeah, that was
right
yeah.
on the Whitney.
Yeah.
Right across from the
Right across from the Whitney.
Yeah.
A different assembly district.
There's still some outstanding issues. I mean, for Gansevoort to move forward, the state had to authorize alienation. But with the alienation, there was supposed to be a four-way deal, and so it's actually incomplete. So it can't move forward at this point.
Exactly. Yep. It's the footprint of the facility needs a little bit of Hudson River Park, which, as you mentioned, requires state approval and state action. So
Barry Dillon.
yeah.
He's ready to do something like that.
We can move it into the river. So yeah, nothing has happened on that at all. They just they spent some money on planning, but that's it there. So why exactly is it that people don't want these in their neighborhood? And the answer is it's mostly due to the trucks. The truck traffic can be immense on these things. They're loud. There's a lot of noise. It causes congestion. There have been there are real asthma clusters around where these are. These are diesel trucks. Soot, particulate matter. It's causing health problems in these neighborhoods. And the last piece is the Department of Sanitation doesn't actually have enough parking spaces for all their trucks, so they end up parking them on the street. And nothing gets people more wound up than losing their parking spaces. So, I mean, you guys know this. So, so the question is, has the city reduced the amount of mileage from the trucks? This line on the left axis is the mileage, and the bars are the right axis. The bars are just the tonnage per day, and the left axis is the mileage. And yeah, it's down about 19%. However, I will caution, just to kind of explain this, if you added up all the odometers on all the trucks, this is not the number you would get. Because I'm excluding the mileage that the trucks drive in your neighborhood to pick up the garbage, under the assumption that no matter what you do, the truck's got to drive down every street to get your garbage. And I don't know exactly where and when and which streets they go down. So this is a calculation of the amount of miles they drive from the garage to get to the district, driving over to the transfer station, driving back to the garage, and also the amount of truck mileage from the transfer station that heads out of the city. So this is the component that the city has some control over. So as you can see, we're producing less waste, we have less mileage. The city's done a few things. They built a few new garages, shifted some routes. That's also dropped the mileage down a little bit. And then there's also a component of export. By switching from truck to barge and rail, you put less trucks on the road. You know, in particular, you know, with the opening of the Marine Transfer Station, especially it was in Queens, that displaced a lot of truck export mileage. And so you're probably going to see this continue to dip down as more of those Marine Transfer Stations open. So where are we overall? We've guaranteed landfill space, so we're all set there, but the costs are actually a little higher than anticipated. Recycling is a little better than it appears. You know, we have that headwind in the waste stream, but we've had improvement with capturing more and expanding acceptance, so that's been helpful. And we've had some progress on equity and environmental impact. It's been delayed, but you know, we have less truck mileage, and we have managed to at least spread the infrastructure further over the city. So looking ahead, I just want to touch on a couple things that weren't in the plan and have sort of appeared later. The first one is the Department of Sanitation has started talking about single stream recycling. They say they're going to do it. That's where you don't have 2 bins for recycling, you just have 1. So, you know, then the processor separates them out themselves. So that has the potential to increase the capture rate, increase the diversion rate, just makes it easier for people who might have more participation. Helpful. The next thing is organics. Organics includes like grass.
Cheaper to pick up.
Yeah, exactly. Because you can fit more in a truck. Yeah. Organics, that's like grass clippings, leaves, food waste, you know, like vegetable stuff, chicken bones, not like diapers or anything like that, just, you know, sort of the stuff that's a little cleaner. You know, the city currently has a pilot for organics collection. It's operating in, you know, Staten Island, some neighborhoods in Queens and Brooklyn. However, you know, there are some issues with whether that's going to be able to be rolled out citywide. You know, the first is, you know, is there enough processing and composting facility around the city? Currently, there is not. So, you know, before you go citywide, you got to figure out where you're going to send this stuff. The second one is public participation. People have been really excited about putting their grass clippings and leaves on the curb, but they've been a little less excited about storing their food waste for the week and waiting to put that outside. However, if you did manage to get this system going and it worked, you know, organics is the biggest part of the refuse stream that we're sending to landfills. So if you got this to work, I mean, you could move a huge portion over to, you know, composting or recycling somehow.
What happens to the organics that are collected?
The what?
What happens to the compost or organics that are collected? It goes to
Fertilizer.
compost?
Well,
fertilizer? It becomes...
it's still a pilot, so they're trying a lot of different things. I mean, there's a composting facility on Staten Island, and, you know, they give away the compost to community organizations and farms and gardens. I believe the idea is that, and they might already be doing this, it might not be, but they're going to sell the compost. You know, the farms outside the city will use this stuff. You know, they're also sending some of it to the anaerobic digesters, which the Department of Sanitation is wastewater management. So, you know, these big digesters, you know, take you know, wastewater and, you know, process it and allow it to be discharged. But I mean, this is organic matter, so you can also dump a little bit of the organics in there, and it'll process it, and you end up with kind of this like biosolids, which is kind of high in well, phosphorus and all that stuff. So, you know, there's kind of a few ideas about, you know, what you might do with this and how you might process it. The last piece, I'm sure you've heard about de Blasio's initiative, zero waste to landfills by 2030. I think it's kind of more of a goal, and, you know, it's not as fleshed out as the solid waste management plan was.
As it were.
But I just want to leave you, you know, with kind of one thought, and these are some big ifs. But if we continue to have less waste, and, you know, that gap continues to grow with what we built for versus what we actually have, and single stream works, so we're taking more refuse out of the system. Organics works, and now we're composting a bunch of that refuse. And we're actually, in 2030, we're kind of getting to somewhere where, like, you know, we're getting our refuse down and not much is going to landfills. Then you end up with a situation where we've built our system, the rail export and the marine transfer stations, for a solid waste management that has a very high amount of refuse, but we just don't have that much refuse to export anymore. And that could be just 10 years after we open all of these new facilities. And it could be a situation where, you know, you have to retrofit them for commercial waste or organics export, or you might have to use them for something differently. And so, you know, this is going to be what the next solid waste management plan, or how we adjust the last 10 years of the plan, is going to be, you know, dealing with these trends in the composition of the waste.
I presume also those long-term contracts, you still would be paying for landfills you're not using?
Yeah, there's, I mean, it's not fixed. There's a fixed component to it where you pay them a recurring fee, and then there's a sliding component based on the amount of waste. So they would save some money, but there's probably also a way to break it, I guess, somewhere in there. I don't know what that would cost, but yeah, you're kind of stuck in this.
I have two questions that might sound crazy, but have they ever, is it too costly to explore non-diesel sanitation trucks? Because I know in the negotiation with like Fresh Direct in the South Bronx, they converted their trucks to non-diesel because there was a community outrage.
Yeah.
So I'm just wondering, is that just too costly to convert?
I mean, it is costly, and then also obviously it's going to take time.
Yeah.
But eventually it'll happen.
And then the other question I have is there any analysis as they roll out this plan on job creation opportunities that might help with the fairness equity discussion? Like if you're moving towards organics collection, is there anything there that could be thought about?
I mean, not an analysis that I'm aware of. You know, presumably if you're collecting more streams, you know, you need more trucks and more drivers. So I mean, it could do something for the Department of Sanitation. Yeah, if the composting occurs, you know, in the city, like, you know, you expanded the one on Staten Island. If you ship the waste out of the city and compost it there, it wouldn't. Mm-hmm. So yeah, I mean, there are probably some opportunities there. You know, I'm not sure of the size of them per se, but you know, if you have less waste overall, that could also, you know, put a crunch on the collection.
I mean, just to take your point, back to the recycling and the nickel deposit.
Yeah.
You could, in theory, take the nickel deposit, turn it into just a tax, if you will, to fund recycling efforts. And then you could use that to increase the recycling efforts and have those very people who are now taking that garbage apart, they could be doing it at one of these facilities and getting paid for it.
Right.
Yeah.
That would be the fantasy. Yeah.
Well,
Yeah.
You raised it. So.
So, maybe I misunderstood, but have we made progress on equity and environmental impact in the city by exporting our environmental problems out of the city, to other states and other parts of New York?
Some are New York City.
City problem.
Yes, I understand that.
Yeah. So, you know, you look at the impacts outside of the city. You know, at one point we were, you know, sending trucks to like Western New York with our waste. Now it's mostly rail. So that's been an improvement. You know, obviously moving Fresh Kills landfill and just sending it out of the city is one thing that, you know, that's been shifting it outside the city. I think there is an element of that, but obviously the less refuse the city sends out of the city, then the lower impact there is. So there has been a transfer there, but, you know, hopefully the city becoming more sustainable also helps.
It can be considered economic development.
The social costs of landfills are lower where there's more land to fill.
No, it could be. It could be. I mean, I don't know where these landfills are in Western New York and Jersey.
There's a lot of space there already.
Yeah, Pennsylvania is another big one. Yeah, central Pennsylvania, like Scranton area.
Right, I mean, but that's a depressed area, right? That's why they're willing to take New York City garbage.
Yes.
So maybe we got it out of the South Bronx, but now it's in Scranton.
Yeah.
It's the invisible hand.
Yes. Yes, and I have many colleagues who would tell you this is a perfectly great thing because it's cheaper to send it out of the city and
yeah. And, you know,
those folks said yes, so.
Yeah, you have the asthma cluster, the environmental issues in the South Bronx, but, you know, you can pay to, you know, send the waste and some of the associated traffic and although,
the asthma.
Yeah, although I will note that some of the issues in the city had to do with the transfer stations, which no matter what you do with it, you're going to have a transfer station. Right. There's kind of the clustering of that. But yeah, like the movement of waste, you know, further and further from the city is certainly.
We're moving it by rail as opposed to truck.
No,
Truck
I
is
agree. I
longer.
mean, it's
Yeah.
gotta go somewhere.
Yeah,
and-
And they're not gonna put it in downtown Buffalo, it's gonna be out in rural areas too.
Right, right.
Or at least more, less populated.
Yeah.
All right. Well, Dan, it was fascinating, really.
Thank you.
Very,
Thanks.
very good. Thank you. I mean, I think both these presentations were terrific. So, thank you, Paul and Ann. Do we have any other business? We do not, as far as I know.
Very
So, typically, we will have our next meeting in January, February, and look for a communication from Tara, I guess, about the availability for the next meeting. Until then, thank you everybody for your active and enthusiastic participation. Welcome again, Mark, Jennifer, and can I have a motion to adjourn?
I second the motion.
You're bold. You're both very bold. All right, so we have adjourned. Thank you.
It's like that's not in the minutes.
Yeah, it's in the minutes. It's in the minutes.